Pay attention to the man in this video, as he is hiding the most disturbing secret.
Hello, Lori. I guess it's a real mess, isn't it? It wasn't supposed to go like that. I don't know what to tell you.
Imagine you're just 18 years old, standing at the very edge of adulthood. Your life is supposed to be about freedom, fun, and endless possibilities. But instead of college dreams, weekend hangouts, and planning your future, you suddenly find yourself in the grip of pure evil. This is the story of Brook Weber, born Charlene Brooke Leeser, whose life changed forever one night in August 1996. What started as a seemingly normal drive with her boyfriend turned into a nightmare so horrific that it still echoes in true crime history. Brook and her boyfriend, Jeffrey Wolfe, thought they were simply meeting up with someone to settle a debt. But the man they went to see wasn't just any man. He was Gary Carl Simmons Jr., a 33-year-old local butcher in Moss Point, Mississippi. A man with knives, with experience in dismembering animals, and with darkness inside him that would soon unleash the unthinkable. That night, Brook was forced to stare death in the face. She was dragged into a nightmare of fear, betrayal, and blood. Her boyfriend would never make it out alive. Brook, against all odds, would survive. What makes this case so chilling is not just the brutality of the crime, but the calculated cruelty behind it. This is not just a story about murder. It's a story about betrayal, survival, and the shocking reality of the evil that sometimes hides behind ordinary faces. By the end of this documentary, you will see how Brook's strength turned her from a victim into a survivor, and how the so-called butcher of Moss Point was finally brought down. Before we dive into the crime itself, let's understand the people at the heart of the story. Charlene Brooke Leeser, later known as Brook Weber, was only 18 years old, bright, hopeful, and still figuring out her path in life. She had just started dating Jeffrey Wolfe, a young man she cared deeply about. Like many young couples, their relationship was fresh, filled with excitement, but also with real-life challenges. One of those challenges was Jeffrey's connection to Gary Carl Simmons Jr. Simmons was no stranger. In fact, he was someone Jeffrey knew because of drugs. Jeffrey owed Simmons money, a drug-related debt that had been lingering. It wasn't a large amount, but it was enough to create tension. Simmons, on the surface, lived a double life. By trade, he was a butcher. Neighbors described him as quiet, even ordinary, but behind closed doors, he was something else entirely. He lived in a small house in Moss Point, Mississippi, with his roommate and accomplice, Timothy Milano. Together, the two would become responsible for one of the most disturbing crimes in the region's history. Milano wasn't the mastermind. He was more of an enabler, someone who followed Simmons's lead. Simmons, however, was the one with the tools, the plan, and the twisted drive. So on that fateful night in August 1996, when Brook and Jeffrey drove to Simmons' house, they had no idea they were walking into a trap. It was August 12, 1996. The summer heat clung to the air in Mississippi as Brook and Jeffrey got into the car. Their plan was simple: drive to Simmons' house in Moss Point, settle the drug debt, and leave. But Simmons had already decided things would not go that way. In his mind, Jeffrey Wolfe wasn't just someone who owed him money. He was someone he wanted to eliminate. When Brook and Jeffrey arrived at the house, Simmons and Milano welcomed them inside. At first, nothing seemed unusual, but then, in a matter of seconds, the atmosphere shifted. Simmons pulled out a gun. He pointed it directly at Jeffrey and Brook. What happened next was horrifying. Simmons and Milano separated the couple. Jeffrey was bound, his fate sealed. Brook was dragged to another part of the house, held against her will, and terrified beyond words. She had no idea what was happening to Jeffrey, only that something terrible was unfolding. For Jeffrey, the night would end in violence. He was brutally attacked, shot, and killed. His body was never seen whole again. Simmons, the butcher, did exactly what his profession suggested. He dismembered Jeffrey, disposing of his remains in the most grotesque way imaginable, scattering them in a swamp, making sure no single part could easily be recovered. Meanwhile, Brook was kept alive. Why? Because Simmons had a different plan for her. She would be his captive, a witness to his cruelty, and a pawn in his twisted game. This wasn't just about debt anymore. This was about control, about Simmons showing his dominance, and about proving that he could play God with people's lives. Brook's hours inside that house were filled with unimaginable terror. Simmons made it clear she was not free to leave. He held her captive, taunting her, threatening her, reminding her that Jeffrey was gone and that she could be next if she didn't obey. For Brook, every second was about survival. She had to stay calm. She had to find a way to get out alive. She endured Simmons's control, his cruelty, and his chilling confidence. At times, he seemed to take pleasure in reminding her of his skills as a butcher. He hinted at what he had already done to Jeffrey and what could happen to her. For an 18-year-old girl, the fear was overwhelming. But Brook was smart. She realized that if she panicked, she would die. So she pretended to cooperate. She listened. She watched. She waited. And in those terrifying hours, she was already planning her escape. Finally, when Simmons let his guard down, Brook seized her chance. She ran. Barefoot, terrified but alive, she escaped the house of horrors and ran for help. When she reached safety, she told the authorities everything. Every detail about Simmons, every word he had spoken, every clue that could lead them back to him. Brook had survived, and now she was determined to make sure Jeffrey got justice. When police heard Brook's story, they knew they had a nightmare on their hands. This wasn't just an ordinary murder. It was a crime carried out by someone with chilling precision. Investigators wasted no time. Brook's testimony gave them the names, the house, and the confidence to act quickly. Within hours, Gary Simmons and Timothy Milano were arrested. But here's what's truly chilling. Simmons didn't act like a man caught off guard. He acted calm, almost smug, as though he thought he could talk his way out of it. His butcher background gave him a disturbing confidence. He believed the way he disposed of Jeffrey's body would make conviction impossible. After all, without a body, how could they prove murder? But Simmons underestimated two things: modern forensics and Brook's will to fight. Detectives collected evidence from his home, from the swamp, and from every detail Brook provided. And while Simmons initially denied everything, the walls quickly began to close in. Milano, his accomplice, broke down faster. He knew the evidence was strong, and he wasn't as hardened as Simmons. His cooperation helped strengthen the case against both of them. For investigators, the case was horrifying, but it was also airtight. Simmons may have thought he could butcher a man and erase the evidence, but he was wrong. Science, testimony, and determination were stronger than his cruelty. The trial of Gary Carl Simmons Jr. and Timothy Milano was nothing short of chilling. Prosecutors laid out every detail of the crime, from the moment Brook and Jeffrey arrived at Simmons's home to the horrific disposal of Jeffrey's remains. Brook herself testified. Imagine the courage it took for her to walk into that courtroom, look at the man who had destroyed her life, and tell the world what he had done. She described the fear, the threats, and the moment she realized Jeffrey was gone. Her testimony was powerful, emotional, and unshakable, and combined with forensic evidence, it painted a picture the jury could not ignore. The jury didn't take long to decide. Timothy Milano was sentenced to life in prison without parole. But for Simmons, the punishment was harsher. For his cruelty, his arrogance, and his brutal actions, he was sentenced to death. The so-called butcher would face the ultimate justice. Simmons was sent to death row, where he spent years awaiting his fate. For Brook, those years were filled with healing, with trying to reclaim the pieces of her life that had been stolen. But justice, though slow, finally came. On June 20th, 2012, nearly 16 years after the crime, Simmons was executed by lethal injection in Mississippi. Brook was there. She faced the man who had tormented her and murdered Jeffrey Wolfe. For her, it wasn't about revenge. It was about closure, about proving that no matter how horrific the crime, justice could still prevail. As for Milano, he remains behind bars, living out the rest of his life in prison. The case of Brook Weber is one of the most harrowing stories of survival in true crime history. It's a story of evil, but also of unimaginable strength. Brook was only 18 years old when she endured the worst night of her life. She lost her boyfriend, Jeffrey Wolfe, in the most brutal way imaginable. She was threatened, traumatized, and forced to face the darkest side of humanity. And yet she lived, she escaped, she testified, she fought for justice. Today, Brook is more than just a survivor. She is a symbol of resilience. She represents every victim who has ever been silenced, reminding the world that survival is possible even in the darkest of moments. Her story also forces us to confront difficult truths about drugs, about the dangers of trust, and about the monsters who sometimes hide behind ordinary faces. But above all, it leaves us with this: evil does not always win. Sometimes strength, courage, and justice are stronger. Brook Weber will forever be remembered not just as a victim of Gary Simmons, but as the young woman who survived him and lived to tell the world the truth.